The night smelled of roses and roasted lamb. Silk rustled against marble floors as courtiers whispered beneath chandeliers that dripped with molten gold. In the great hall, laughter rang, high, brittle, and desperate. The dynasty had survived decades of war, betrayal, and famine. Tonight, it was meant to celebrate peace. But peace, like all fragile things, can be poisoned. As goblets clinked and toasts were made, a chill threaded through the air, unnoticed at first. Within the hour, the music would die. By dawn, the most powerful bloodline in the kingdom would lie cold, their empire crumbling before the first light touched the banners. History remembers their fall as a mystery. Some whisper of betrayal from within. Others speak of divine punishment. But one truth echoes louder than all, that power is never lost in battle. It is devoured at the banquet table. Before we descend into that fatal night, into its feasts, whispers and venom, take a moment to subscribe if you crave stories where history bleeds, and every crown is heavy with secrets, because tonight, we dine with ghosts. The palace of Lysandra had never shone brighter. On the night the dynasty celebrated its 30th year upon the throne, every torch was lit, every marble column wound with silk banners, every hall scented with myrrh and crushed orange blossoms. The air trembled with the hum of musicians and the murmur of hundreds of voices, nobles, soldiers, ambassadors, and courtiers, all bound together by the illusion of unity. Outside, the city starved. But inside, the tables groaned beneath roasted pheasants, jeweled fruits, and honeyed wine poured from silver amphorae. It was said the king himself had ordered gold leaf sprinkled across the pastries, so that even sweetness may taste of triumph. He sat upon his throne that night, old but unbent, his beard silvered by both wisdom and regret. The queen at his side glittered in pearls the size of tears. Between them, the royal children laughed too loudly, too easily, each one aware of how the other's smiles were daggers in disguise. The courtiers called it a night of reconciliation. The scholars would later call it the last night of the House of Lysandra. A harp trembled. A servant's tray clattered to the floor. Someone laughed to cover the sound. Across the hall, candles guttered for a moment as a draft swept through. A whisper from an unseen door. It was nothing, they said, but there was something in the air, faint as a bruise. The scent of almonds, sharp and bitter. The royal chronicler, a quiet man named Arian, stood near the dais, ink-stained hands hidden in his sleeves. He watched everything, the flicker of fear in the queen's eyes when the ambassador from Valmir approached. The quick exchange between the eldest prince and his physician, the way the king lifted his goblet but did not drink. To Arian, the court was a living beast, jeweled, perfumed, and ravenous. He had written its victories, chronicled its laws, and recorded its crimes. But that night, he sensed something different. A pulse beneath the laughter, a rhythm that did not belong to music. Outside the great windows, thunder rolled though no storm was near. The queen rose, her voice soft as silk over stone. "My lords," she began, "tonight we feast not only for peace, but for the endurance of our blood. Let this banquet remind the world that the House of Lysandra will reign for generations yet unborn." Applause thundered through the hall. Cups lifted. Arian hesitated, watching the servants refill goblets from a new cask of red wine. He noted how they avoided the king's eyes, how one trembled so hard that droplets fell upon her sleeve. The band began to play again, a lilting melody from the southern provinces. The young princes danced, the nobles cheered, and the king finally drank. For a heartbeat, all was as it should be: music, laughter, and the illusion of safety. Then, the candle nearest Arian flared and went out. He looked toward the dais. The queen had gone pale. The eldest prince was gripping his throat, but the moment passed. The music swelled. Servants cleared the first course, bringing in roasted swans wreathed in flame. The hall brightened again. Perhaps it had been nothing. Perhaps imagination alone could poison a man's thoughts. Still, Arian could not shake the feeling that the night itself was holding its breath. At the far end of the table, the youngest princess leaned close to her nurse and whispered, "Why did the stars look different tonight?" The nurse did not answer. She was staring at her own reflection in the wine, and seeing perhaps a shadow that did not belong. In the gallery above, a clock struck midnight. The guests rose for the royal toast, unaware that it would be their last. The king stood, voice heavy but steady. "To our ancestors," he declared, "who built this realm upon faith and courage. May their strength live within us always." Hundreds of goblets lifted, shimmering in the candlelight like blood before the cut. Arian wrote the words in his journal, his hand trembling. He would later note, though no one would believe him, that when the king finished his toast, the echo did not fade. It lingered, soft and hollow, as though another voice had repeated it from somewhere unseen, and beneath that echo came a sound he could never forget. A faint, deliberate clink of glass like a toast made in secret. The feast continued, but the night had already turned. The moment came quietly, not with a scream, but with a sigh. At first, it seemed no more than drunken laughter, the kind that follows too much wine and too little truth. A noblewoman at the lower table collapsed against her husband's shoulder, giggling through trembling lips. A servant rushed forward to help her, and froze when crimson streaked from her mouth, dark and thin as ink. Then another guest fell. Then another. The music faltered, strings snapping beneath frantic fingers. Dancers stopped mid-step. The scent of roses and roasted lamb curdled into something metallic, the raw tang of fear. From the dais, the king's voice boomed across the hall. "Guards!" But even his command was too slow. Around him, goblets dropped from shaking hands, splashing dark wine across embroidered linens like spilled blood. The queen's pearls scattered across the marble as she clutched her chest. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts, her pupils wide with confusion. One of her ladies screamed, the sound so shrill it seemed to slice the air in two. Arian stood rooted in place, his ink-stained fingers white against the quill he still held. Every instinct told him to flee, yet his duty bound him to witness. That was the burden of the chronicler, to see, to remember, to write what others wished forgotten. The first to die was Lord Saren, the treasurer, his mouth twisted in disbelief. The second was the young envoy from Valmir, whose wine had been poured by a trembling servant moments before the toast. Within minutes, a dozen guests lay motionless on the floor. The poison worked swiftly, but not mercifully. Those who drank deeply suffered the worst, eyes rolling back, limbs convulsing, foam gathering at the corners of their lips. Others merely slumped in their seats, faces paling to the color of wax. The sound that filled the hall was not of music now, but of choking, a wet, terrible chorus. And through it all, Arian could hear the ticking of the great clock in the gallery, steady and indifferent, measuring the end of a dynasty. The king tried to rise, his hand still gripping the armrest of his throne. "Find the source," he rasped. "Seal the doors!" The guards obeyed. Heavy iron gates slammed shut with a thunderous clang, trapping nobles, servants, and royals alike inside the gilded tomb. Outside, thunder cracked, though the skies remained clear. The air thickened, with fear, with vomit, with death. Arian pressed a sleeve to his mouth. He could taste the bitterness of almonds now, clinging to the back of his throat. He had not drunk from his goblet, but the scent alone was enough to burn through the senses. The youngest princess, no more than 12, clung to her nurse, whispering prayers. "Is this God's punishment?" she asked. No one answered. Near the table, the eldest prince staggered to his feet, clutching the tablecloth for balance. "The wine," he gasped. "It's in the wine." But even as he spoke, he fell. The queen crawled toward her husband, pearls scattering in her wake like drops of moonlight. Her fingers brushed his, trembling, before her body went still. In that frozen instant, Arian saw not a queen and king, but a man and woman, old, tired, undone by the very loyalty they once commanded. He felt something in him break. As the poison claimed the hall, the survivors turned on one another. Accusations flew. It was the Valmir envoy, the servants, the queen's handmaidens, until the din became madness. One of the guards drew his sword and cut down a servant who ran for the door. Blood spattered across the white marble. The first of the night, but not the last. Arian stumbled toward the dais, clutching his journal to his chest. "Your Majesty," he whispered, though the king's eyes were already glazing over. In that moment, the torches flickered. The great doors groaned as if the palace itself was mourning. Somewhere in the chaos, a lute string snapped with a sound like a scream. And then, silence. Only Arian's ragged breath broke the stillness. Around him lay the feast's remains, overturned goblets, spilled wine, bodies folded like discarded garments. The perfume of lilies poured from shattered vases mingled with the stench of vomit and blood. He knelt beside the royal table, dipping his quill in the spilled wine. He could not help himself, he wrote. His words trembled across the parchment. "This night, the gods have feasted upon kings." But before he could write more, the great doors shook under a heavy blow from the outside. The guards exchanged terrified glances. Whoever waited beyond those doors, ally or enemy, had perfect timing. Arian realized then that the poison was only the beginning. And as the bolt slid free and the doors creaked open, a gust of cold air swept through the hall, snuffing out half the candles. The dead did not stir, but the living looked up, pale and shaking, toward the figures stepping through the doorway. Their silhouettes gleamed with steel. The soldiers who entered the banquet hall wore the insignia of the royal guard, the sunburst sigil of Lysandra. Yet their armor was blackened, their faces hidden beneath veils of chainmail. They did not come to rescue. They came to end what had begun. The leader stepped forward, his boots echoing across the marble strewn with pearls and corpses. "By decree of His Grace, the Duke of Marrow," he declared, "the house of Lysandra is dissolved. The king is dead. The crown passes by right of survival." But there were no survivors who mattered. Arian's pen stilled in his trembling hand. The Duke of Marrow, the king's own cousin, had been exiled years ago for treason. Rumor said he had fled north to raise a mercenary army, swearing vengeance for the death of his son, that he would return one day with fire and poison. And now he had kept his promise. The soldiers moved like shadows among the fallen, checking for signs of life. When they found any, the glint of a blade quickly followed. It was swift, mechanical, and silent, a massacre disguised as mercy. Arian pressed himself against a pillar, the taste of ink and fear heavy in his mouth. His mind reeled through the fragments of memory that had led to this night. The endless court intrigues, the whispers of betrayal, the slow decay of trust between the king and his council. The poison had been poured long before the feast began, not into the goblets, but into hearts. He remembered the year the king's armies had burned Marrow's lands after the failed rebellion. The screams that echoed through the valleys, the queen's secret letters pleading for clemency that never came, the duke's son, no older than the princess now lying pale upon the floor, executed at dawn by the royal decree. Yes, Arian thought bitterly. The blood of kings had called its answer home. As he watched, one of the masked soldiers lifted the crown from the dead king's head. Gold gleamed under the candlelight, still wet with sweat and blood. "For the duke," the soldier murmured, before wrapping it in cloth. Arian felt his pulse race. The crown of Lysandra, symbol of a lineage that had ruled for 3 generations, was no longer a relic of divine right, but a trophy. He should have fled. But something in him refused. The chronicler's curse, to witness, to understand. He moved quietly through the carnage, his sandals slipping on blood-slick marble. He found the youngest princess beneath the table where she had hidden. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Are we dreaming?" she whispered. "No," he said softly. "But you must not wake." He covered her eyes before the soldiers saw her. Through the open doors, Arian glimpsed the courtyard beyond, flames rising where the royal stables once stood. The night sky glowed red, as though the heavens themselves had caught fire. The air outside rang with the sound of steel and screaming. The duke's men had not merely come for the royal family. They had come for the city. He turned back to the hall. the place where history had broken. Every tapestry, every gilded cup, every mural of triumph now looked obscene. The banquet table stretched like an altar, the bodies laid upon it as offerings to vengeance. And yet, beneath the horror, Arian felt something else: inevitability. The house of Lysandra had been born in war, baptized in blood and sustained by cruelty. The king's father had seized power through the slaughter of his rivals. His sons had ruled through fear. Even the queen's beauty had been a weapon, her marriage a bargain struck with blood. What else could such a lineage produce but poison? He thought of the courtiers who had smiled while starving peasants begged at the gates, of the generals who burned villages in the name of loyalty, of the songs sung to drown out the cries of the dying. Now the silence was their requiem. A soldier's hand seized Arian by the collar, yanking him from his thoughts. "You!" the man barked. "Scribe! The Duke wants witnesses. You'll write what he commands." Arian stared at him, defiant even through his terror. "I write what truth commands," he said quietly. The soldier hesitated, then struck him across the face. Blood filled Arian's mouth, copper and salt, but still he did not speak. They dragged him toward the throne. There, beneath the crumbling banners, a man awaited, cloaked in black fur, eyes like ash and iron. The Duke of Marrow. He looked not triumphant, but weary, as if vengeance had aged him more than exile ever could. "So," he said softly, studying the scribe. "You are the chronicler, the one who wrote my condemnation." Arian bowed his head. "I wrote the truth as I saw it, my lord." The Duke smiled, not cruelly, but with the hollow pity of one who has outlived mercy. "Then write this too," he said. "Write that kings die not by swords but by their own banquets. Write that their crowns are forged from the bones of those they forgot." He turned away. "And when you are done, burn it all." But Arian did not burn it. He would survive, barely, and his words would carry the story that the Duke had tried to erase, a tale whispered for centuries, of the night a dynasty devoured itself from within. Outside, the city screamed as dawn broke over a kingdom without a king. The blood of Lysandra had run its course. Morning came like an intruder, pale, uninvited, cruel. The sun rose over a city that no longer belonged to itself. The banners of Lysandra, once bright with gold and crimson, hung limp and blackened with soot. The streets were littered with the remnants of celebration: overturned carriages, trampled garlands, and the shattered remains of goblets flung from palace windows. Smoke drifted through the capital in thick, silent waves. From a distance, it looked like fog. Up close, it smelled of burnt silk and flesh. By the time the palace gates opened, the dynasty was gone. The Duke of Marrow had taken his throne before dawn, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. His men hailed him as savior, yet his eyes betrayed only the hollow certainty of one who knew that salvation and damnation were often the same. He ordered the bodies of the royal family buried at dusk, not in the royal crypt, but in the gardens where the banquet had taken place. "Let them feed the soil they bled for," he said. No priests were summoned, no rites performed. The roses that grew there in the months to come would be unnaturally red. Arian watched from the edge of the courtyard, bound but breathing. The chronicler had been spared execution, for now. The Duke believed he could shape the story, command the words, rewrite the past. But words like poison have their own will. In the taverns of the lower city, whispers had already begun. They say the queen saw death himself at the feast. They say the wine came from Valmir, a gift of peace that carried vengeance. They say the Duke never lifted a blade. He only opened the doors. Rumor was the first heir of every fallen empire. By the second week, rebellion stirred in the southern provinces. The generals who had once sworn loyalty to the crown now fought under new banners. Merchants closed their ports, priests preached of divine wrath, and the people, lost between grief and rage, began to turn on one another. The Duke ruled not through faith, but through fear. The pyres burned for days. Traitors, thieves, loyalists, anyone who spoke too loudly of the old king. Arian was forced to write decrees announcing the rebirth of the realm. His hand obeyed, but his heart rebelled. Every word he penned felt like a betrayal, a second poisoning of truth. He could not wash the ink from his fingers. It clung like guilt. He wrote in secret, too. In the margins of his official records, between the lines of propaganda, he hid fragments of the truth, small, invisible rebellions. The Duke's men poisoned the wine. The Queen tried to warn them. The youngest princess still breathes. For yes, though few knew it, one child had escaped. On the night of the massacre, as the palace gates burned and steel clashed in the corridors, a handmaiden had carried the princess through the servants' tunnels, vanishing into the labyrinth beneath the city. Some claimed she died in the catacombs, others said she crossed the sea, growing up in exile under another name. Arian never learned her fate, but he dreamed often of her, the way she had whispered, "Are we dreaming?" Before the world collapsed, years passed. The Duke's rule hardened into tyranny. The city that once gleamed with marble and song became gray and mute. The markets emptied. The churches fell silent. The people learned to speak in murmurs, to smile only when watched. And still, the gardens bloomed, lush, crimson, perfumed. The flowers fed on royal blood and grew more beautiful with each passing season. Visitors would come from distant lands to admire them, never knowing they stood above a graveyard. One night, Arian was summoned to the Duke's chamber. The ruler was old now, his once black hair white as frost. "Tell me," he said, "what does history remember of that night?" Arian met his gaze. "History remembers what it must," he replied. The Duke chuckled bitterly. "Then write it as peace. Write that the poison was justice." But Arian did not. When he returned to his chamber, he opened the secret ledger he had kept hidden beneath the floorboards. On the first blank page, he wrote with shaking hand, "Empires die not in war, but in silence, when the truth is buried beneath roses." That night, he sealed his writings in a copper chest and hid them within the old chapel walls, where no one would think to look. Centuries later, when the kingdom's ruins were uncovered, the chest would be found, and the world would remember the feast of poison once more, not as a victory, but as a warning. The Duke of Marrow died the next morning. His physicians called it heart failure. Some whispered that his wine had been tampered with, and so the poison made its final circle, from cup to crown, from king to usurper. History, after all, never wastes its lessons. It only waits for those foolish enough to repeat them. Centuries passed, and the palace of Lysandra became a ruin. Where marble floors once echoed with laughter, only wind and dust remained. The chandeliers that had glittered like constellations now hung as skeletons of rusted bronze. Ivy crept through shattered windows, and the great banquet hall, the stage of betrayal, lay buried beneath a century of ash and silence. Yet even in ruin, the story endured. Travelers spoke of strange music heard among the stones on moonless nights, faint strains of harp and flute, as if the old court still danced in ghostly procession. Shepherds claimed they saw candlelight flicker through the broken arches, though no fire was ever found. And every spring, without fail, the roses bloomed blood-red over the palace gardens, their perfume heavy as memory. The people called them the Emperor's roses, the flowers that fed on kings. No one remembered the names of the guests who had died that night. The dynasty's symbols had faded, its banners forgotten, its bloodlines scattered and diluted through time. But the story survived. It was told around hearths, in monasteries, in the whispers of lovers and the prayers of beggars. Some said it was a curse, that the gods had poisoned the wine themselves to punish arrogance. Others believed it was vengeance, that the Duke's hand had been guided by justice long denied. A few, braver or perhaps wiser, said it was neither fate nor divine will, only the inevitable end of greed wearing a crown. In time, poets rewrote it. Painters romanticized it. Minstrels softened its edges with song. The massacre became legend, the poison a metaphor, the king a tragic hero rather than a tyrant. The truth, buried beneath layers of beauty and art, became the sweetest poison of all. And so the feast never truly ended. It simply changed its table. In every empire that rose from the ashes of the old, there was always another banquet, another toast, another promise of peace made with trembling hands. Rulers swore that they had learned the lesson of Lysandra, even as they built new palaces over the bones of the old. Arrian's hidden manuscript, discovered by chance 300 years later by a wandering monk, told a different story. Its ink had faded to brown, its edges eaten by time, but the words were intact, pressed deep into the parchment as if carved by grief itself. "Power is not stolen," it read. "It is given, piece by piece, cup by cup, until the hand that drinks no longer remembers it was thirsty." The chronicler's testament spread like wildfire through universities and courts. Scholars debated whether Arrian had been real, or whether the Duke himself had written the words in secret repentance. But those who read his account spoke of an unsettling familiarity, as if the poison he described still flowed quietly in their own veins. And perhaps it did. For history, like wine, ferments. Its sweetness turns to bitterness if left too long untouched. In kingdoms that followed, feasts continued, grand, gilded, and doomed in their own ways. Kings toasted alliances they did not trust. Generals celebrated victories won on the backs of the poor. The courtiers laughed too loudly, just as their ancestors had, pretending not to smell the almonds in the air. And somewhere, unseen, the banquet repeated itself, in new palaces, with new names, beneath chandeliers of electric light instead of wax. The poison had changed form. It was no longer poured into goblets, but into words, wealth, and power. The world never stopped dining. In a museum centuries later, the goblet from the Feast of Poison sat behind glass, a dull, silver cup, its surface etched with faint symbols of sun and vine. Visitors paused before it, reading the plaque. Recovered from the ruins of Lysandra, believed to have contained the poison that ended a dynasty. Children pressed their faces to the glass, wide-eyed. Adults moved on quickly, uneasy without knowing why. Yet if one stood long enough, and the room grew still, they might hear it, faint, deliberate, unmistakable, the echo of a toast made in secret. Clink. And they might feel the same chill that silenced the music of that long-dead night. Because the story of Lysandra is not about kings or queens, not even about poison. It is about us, about how easily we lift the cup, how willingly we drink from it, believing ourselves immune to what it holds. The chronicler's final line remains carved in the minds of those who study his work. Beware the banquet of power, for its sweetness masks decay. Every empire ends at its own table. The ink of that warning, centuries old, still bleeds through the page, as if refusing to fade. And if you listen closely, through the hum of our modern feasts, our golden halls, our politics and pleasures, you can almost hear it whisper still. The feast never ended. We are still dining, and the poison is already in the wine.